digest. It's not so much like it's emotional, but it's got a lot of technical aspects to it that make it harder to do like a lecture. So I think it's better to do a discussion. So if at any point I'm saying anything
So Bella Echo is
something
also
didn't
here
fully compute,
at the moment.
please ask me about it. So I would assume most people, their thoughts on the prison industrial complex here is kind of biased. I mean, you guys understand the prison industrial complex is kind of an extension of slavery. It's kind of a way to develop kind of this institutionalized indentured servitude out of people. It's becoming increasingly privatized, right? But then you're having these specialized units that are being developed all around the country. Some are related to immigration, some are related to sex offenses or gun offenses or gang offenses. But you're seeing this new development of units that are designed specifically to house people that are domestic or foreign extremists. And in that category, there's a federal program called the Communications Management Units. And I hate to say I was privileged to be in one, but I do feel in a way privileged to be in one, because had I not been in one and gotten out, the public might not have ever known about it. And I'm not going to say that I was the only person that blew the whistle on it. I wasn't. There were some letters that got out from attorneys that were representing a man by the name of Ralph Doffer. He was housed in one. He was a philanthropist that ran a charity called Feed the Needy. I think it was Feed the Needy was the name of his charity, but essentially what they charged him with was violations of the sanctions that were put in place after the first Iraq War, but before the second Iraq War, because what he was doing with all of his own money was he was taking everything he earned, and with his doctor's license, was purchasing en masse diabetes drugs. He was purchasing penicillin. He was purchasing basic medications, right? And then he was ushering them through Syria into Iraq, and he was bypassing the sanctions that our country was putting on that, on Iraq post the war. The problem with the sanctions, the biggest problem with the sanctions, was its effect on poverty and its effect on children in particular, and the health of the populace there. So, I mean, the Iraqi people were already growing angry. The Iraqi people were suffering. Saddam Hussein was a piece of crap. He wasn't really taking care of his people either. But the sanctions that we were imposing were literally choking out the country. And there's some people that have estimated as many as 1.2 million people died because of the sanctions, not because of the war. And so Ralph Doffer, this was his direct response to dealing with it. Was
how do you spell his name? So I could look
R-A-F-I-L-D-A-F. Yes, sorry, I'll write it down.
R-I-L. History, I mean history.
Yeah, all right.
I will also write his name down for you guys.
After the F, I'm not entirely sure.
In case you can't see it.
Ralph Doffer was one of the first cases where people heard about the Communications Management Unit. It was through his attorney that was representing him. So his charges were breaches of a neutrality agreement. His charges were violating the U.S. sanctions on Iraq. And in addition to that, he was charged with 27 counts of Medicare fraud. The Medicare fraud that he was charged with was not for embezzling money for his own pockets or lining his pockets, but it was each time that he took his Medicare license to the drug sellers to say, I want to purchase these drugs in bulk, to then mail them over there. So it was nothing that was personally beneficial. So the great thing that the FBI had to work with when they were trying to prosecute him were these federal charges of the Medicare fraud, because what he started to do is he started to lose supporters in the process, because people thought that what he was doing was for self-interest, when it wasn't for self-interest at all. So this man, they stacked the charges against him. He's serving over 20 years in prison for making sure that the children of Iraq had access to drugs and had access to penicillin, and he'd save lives. So it's this kind of heartbreaking story, and I use him as an example of what's wrong with the federal prison complex and this kind of secretive or specialized units that they keep these people in. And it raises a second question then. Why is someone like him, who was designated as a minimum security prisoner because he did no violence, right? The charges are minimum, right? And they have this custody classification score sheet. So if you want to talk about some of the process, okay, custody classification runs from 1 to 25, okay? 1 being here, 25 being there, right? 1 to 11 is considered minimum security. 11 to 13 is considered low security. And 13 to 18 is medium. 18 to 24 is high security. And then 24 up, if it goes past 25, is considered maximum security. There is a maximum security facility in the United States in Lawrence, Colorado. It's called the ADX Lawrence. It's actually partially underground. It's the highest security prison in this country. The people that are there are like the Unabomber, Zacharias Moussaoui, one of the other hijackers during 9/11, individuals like Jose Padilla. These are the individuals that are at that facility. Most of the cases that make up the ADX Lawrence are cases where in one way or another they can attribute direct violence to the people, right? So they could say, okay, these individuals can be categorized as maximum security prisoners. We get to label them as terrorists. They actually engage in some sort of activity where you could say these individuals did something. But then you have this whole other demographic of people that didn't do something, but they had some sort of political connection, or they donated to the wrong charity, and all of them make up this low-level prisoner right here, right? But what the government's doing is they want to be able to house these people in a maximum security environment, but the law says they can't. So the laws that have been put in place said we have to house them in a minimum security camp, which essentially doesn't have a fence. It's like a work release program. You sometimes maybe work at a garbage truck, then at night you come back and sleep in a cot. So these guys have these super low points. My points were actually right here for my case. I had more points than most of the Muslim men that were there. When I received notice of transfer, I did 2.5 years in prison in North Carolina, and I'm going to be in a high security prison, so it's about here. It was pretty violent, right? I did 2.5 years there, and then we would have a counselor or a case manager. I taught the GED program there. I was the captain of the soccer team, and I got like essentially all the little silly credits you get along the way while you're in prison to earn low security status, and I was close to leaving. So I got designated as a low security prisoner instead of a medium security prisoner, and I thought I was being transferred. Well, little did I know that when it came time for me to be transferred, instead they transferred me to this communications management unit, essentially a maximum security facility in Marion, Illinois, and I couldn't quite figure out why, because I was 6.5 months away from my deadline of getting out, the time I'm supposed to be released. And what became apparent over the years of the time that I was there was that I was there to balance what they anticipated was going to be a lawsuit related to ethnic disparity of the unit. So when I talk about ethnic disparity, when I got there, they were just starting up that unit. There was only a few people. But by the time I left, there were 28 guys. And out of the 28 guys, 72% were Muslims. And the remainder, the other 28%, were comprised of white power guys, a group specifically called The Order. It's a group that robbed Brinks trucks and threatened to kill federal judges. So these guys are technically maximum security guys, right? Tea Party. One of the founding members of the Tea Party before the Tea Party became an establishment party. His name was Edward Brown. He was an anti-war tax protester. The Tea Party got co-opted somewhere along the way by groups like the Minutemen and groups like the Republican National, GOP and those folks. So they actually had a different narrative. He was part of a group before the Tea Party got convened called the U.S. Constitutional Rangers. A lot of the rhetoric that they espoused mimics some of the end the Fed, Ron Paul kind of whatever it was. But what he did is he started through this process of legislation. He was litigating to put liens on federal judges. saying that these federal judges don't have a right to govern what's happening in my life. I don't want to pay taxes because I don't want it going towards the war. And he started putting these liens on federal judges using this loophole in what was essentially maritime law that they've never done away with. And he called it Uniform Commercial Code. I guess that's the type of law that they practiced. But he would put liens on federal judges, and now all these federal judges were like, you know, we hate this guy. He's tying up our finances. He was exploiting something that is available to us to use. I don't suggest, by the way, that people use it, because if you do, they're going to come after you hard, even though it is your technically legal right to do it. When you start putting liens on federal judges, they're going to come after him, and New Hampshire authorities refused to arrest him, but the feds want him, right? And so the feds kept pressuring New Hampshire to say, you got to arrest this guy. The federal agents in New Hampshire got to arrest it. The federal judges in New Hampshire said, we're not going to allow our arrest to happen. So he ended up getting scooped up at his house after a 3-month standoff. He was essentially holed up in his house. He actually threw a party at his house and had invited everyone to come to his house on the 4th of July, and all these weirdos, like, sorry, I didn't call them weirdos, like Alex Jones and those type of guys were there, like the loose change kind of people. They were there to like celebrate 4th of July with him. And shortly after that, they ordered pizza, okay? And the pizza guys come. Pizza guys are mercenaries, right? So they knew, because they're tapping the phone, okay, they ordered pizza. Pizza van rolls up, and there's like 3 guys. That should be like the first thing. Why is there 3 guys ordering pizza? And he goes to answer the door to get the pizza, and they scoop them up, kind of black bag over your head kind of thing, throw them in the van, and they bring them to Massachusetts, right? And then they throw him out in the parking lot of 7-Eleven, right? So now he's in the parking lot. What the fuck just happened, right? Then the feds pull up. Because the feds can arrest him in Massachusetts, because the federal judge was like, I'll put down a warrant in Massachusetts. But the judges in New Hampshire refused to do it based on their whole like live free or die kind of mentality. So they scooped him up. They raided his house, and they found a stockpile of weapons inside his house. So in addition to the charges of tax evasion, the guy hit his wife 5 years. They also hit him for 20-something years for each gun. And for that, he's serving, I think, 38 years in prison. And so is his wife. They both went together. His wife was a dentist. He was a real estate developer. You know, it was kind of sad. This guy had a cell next to me. But again, not a violent individual. He was from this whole, like, you know, Second Amendment, you know, never threatened violence against anybody or anything else like that. I personally don't like guns, but I recognize the fact that he had a right to have one. But what they tried to do is they tried to use the guns as a way to paint his case as like, he's this real bad militiaman kind of guy. So you had these kind of folks, and then you had folks like, I hate saying this, but labeled as the ELF, Earth Liberation Front. A couple cells down from me was Daniel McGowan. If anybody saw the film If a Tree Falls, he was there for a few months before I left. And that essentially was this remainder, was this kind of pseudo-political cases, myself being an animal rights activist from a group called SHAC, right? And if you look at all of these, and I hate to acknowledge the white power movement as something that's political, but I mean, they were engaging in the political process as well. Every single one of these individuals had a political case, right? Or at least stepped on the toes of the government, right? And then all these Muslim cases, again, they were all political, right? They all donated, they weren't involved with this high level of violence. But the communications management unit, what they did in the inception, and if you want to talk about the history, was Marion, Illinois, Terre Haute, Indiana. Both these institutions were former maximum security prisons. And what they need to do in order to lower the classification from maximum to high or medium security, there's a few things they have to do in order to change this, right? And at first they didn't want to change it at all. They wanted to change the law. They wanted to change the Constitution in order to get people that are down here to be housed in there underneath something called special administrative measures. If anyone's familiar with the case that was brought against Lynn Stewart, she's actually charged with violations of a special administrative measure as an attorney. So essentially she was representing a client, a blind sheikh, who had special administrative measures put on him because of orders from the Pentagon and the White House to put special administrative measures on him. And she was charged with violating that for releasing information to Egyptians and to other individuals that, you know, they should stand down in a conflict. What the military and feds allege against Lynn Stewart was that what she did was misguided, and that it could have been code. Stand down could have meant bomb this building, and that she shouldn't have released any information. And so they sentenced her, obviously, to a lot of jail time for what she did. I think Lynn Stewart's a hero. I also think that she helped to defuse some conflict by doing that. So, sorry.
Yo, guys.
So they wanted to put people in these maximum security confines. They wanted to change the law in order to do so. The first thing that happened was a man by the name of Harley Lapland. Harley Lapland is the director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. He went to Congress and he said that he wanted to make a unit called CTU. I know it sounds kind of silly because that was the unit name in the 24 series. He wanted to make a unit called CTU, the Counterterrorism Unit, and that was based on a model that they were studying in France, that a lot of the Madrid bombers actually came out of the federal prison system that was in France, or the state prison systems that were in France. They went to jail as, you know, someone who stole a purse, or just shoplifted or something like that, but they were leaving radicalized. And so their answer was, when he petitioned Congress, and you're hearing this echoed now through Peter King, was that we need a special unit that takes these guys that are, you know, religious zealots or fundamental in their Islam, and we need to take them out of the population so they don't teach the others about Islam. And then we can let other kinds of Islam get into the prisons. And they actually champion things like the Nation of Islam, or the Moorish Science Temple, and some of these other ones that have racist undertones. So the Federal Bureau of Prisons actually subsidizes literature and DVDs made by Barrakan and other people in order to distribute that information in the prison systems, because it creates a dynamic where blacks are against whites, and people are pitted against one another, and that's actually essential to the way that the prison system works. And I know it's tough to try and say it without sounding conspiratorial, but the guards need that to happen. If that doesn't happen, they lose control. And what they need is they need to make sure that the chow hall, you know, the people where people go to eat, is literally broken up according to race. If it's not broken up according to race, they have this fusion where everyone can now build bridges with one another, and they're outnumbered. They'd rather have people, if they get aggressive, kill each other than kill the guards.
Do you think that was that plan was directly related to the Attica riots in the 1970s? All the prison riots in the 70s?
I actually don't know. I don't know if I can speak intelligently to that. I know that Attica riots, a lot of it had to do with George Jackson being killed, right? So that, I mean, that news spread to that prison yard. People obviously identified with him. The Panthers and the BLA were popular then. I mean, there was that whole kind of Black August phenomenon that was happening.
There was also a lot of white middle class people that were in there with draft dodging and stuff, so there was more political elements.
Yeah. Yeah. But you know what? Based on regional phenomenons, the Northeast really doesn't have the racial breakdown that happens specifically in the Southwest and in the Midwest. Where I served my first prison sentence was in North Carolina. It was Klan country. There was a bit of that, but I kind of stood my ground in being someone who's from New York, and actually, this is really silly sounding, but after getting into a couple of confrontations, the whites didn't want to kill me because they didn't want to deal with the drama of it, right? And they needed an excuse not to kill me, and the excuse they made was because I was mixed. Because on my father's side there is some Arab and whatnot, and they were like, oh, they called me the Mexican Jew, which first off, I'm not Jewish, and I'm not Mexican, but they're just so ignorant that they're just oh, he doesn't eat meat, that must mean he's kosher, and he looks Hispanic, because we were always out in the sun down in North Carolina, so I was a little bit darker than I am now being in New York. But so the racial demographic thing didn't even hit me that hard there, but for my co-defendants that were in California, super ugly. It was they couldn't sit at another table besides the table with the whites. They didn't necessarily have to join the gang, but if they sat at another table, it can get you killed. Not from the blacks, if you sat with blacks, they wouldn't do anything to you. But you'd then walk out in the yard, the other whites would kill you for like kind of breaching their protocol. That you're not allowed to mix in that way.
The shoot here in California gets used a lot against anti-racist activists to try to break down those barriers within prison communities in California. There's been a bunch of cases of anti-racist activists going in there and trying to break down those barriers and then getting pushed and ad saying or shoot or whatever they have here in California.
Yeah, and something similar like that I experienced on a very small level. There was a member from Revolutionary Anarchist Skinheads, anti-fascist group, that was in there for counterfeiting. And so him and I became friends, and they hated him because he looked like the other skinhead guys, but then they see the anarchy thing and like equality tattooed on him, and they didn't understand, and they saw him and I together. And I remember one night where there were like knives out in the yard and they were going to come after us, and the whole thing kind of diffused itself. But really what worked to my advantage is that I worked in the educational department, and I was tutoring everybody for the GED. So I was tutoring white guys with swastikas tattooed on their face. I was also tutoring Bloods and Yenta and Crip and Mexican Mafia. I wanted to show them that no matter what, I believe in everybody. I want everyone to have an education. And so for them, it became this big moral conflict. Like, this is our ticket towards an education. We can't kill this guy, because they wanted to better their lives too. And I was using that as best as I can to try and bring people together and not have this ugliness happen. The truth was that there really wasn't that much racial wars that happened in the first prison that I was at. It was okay. There was violence. It usually was people of the same race jumping each other, or if someone did something out of line, like steal something. Stealing's a no-no in prison. You can't do that. I know that sounds a little bit strange. You think that if people are thieves, wouldn't they steal? If you are a petty thief and you steal something out of someone's locker, it'll get you killed, right? Probably by your own kind. You're allowed to strong-arm someone because that's respected. If you say to someone, I'm taking all your stuff, you're not going to do anything about it, and that person capitulates, the rest of the people respect it. But if you sneak around and you steal something from someone's locker, everyone's all of a sudden looking for you, and I saw that happen with inmates from Washington, D.C. There was a man from Washington, D.C. that stole a pair of Nike sneakers out of a locker that belonged to a man from New York. And there was this tension all of a sudden, did D.C. steal New York stuff? And the yard broke up into two parts. And this is actually the one thing in certain prison yards is New York is an interracial kind of mix. They call it the New York car. It's not a gang, but they call it the car. That means everyone rides together, right? And they're the only group that can really maintain this kind of anti-racist, not political at all, but just where this anti-racist amorphous coagulation of inmates. And I remember it getting very, very heated. I saw things like that looked like swords and stuff. The guards weren't doing anything about it. And the guards just backed up. It's like they ran off the yard because they thought like, okay, it's gonna turn to like Braveheart, and we don't want to get caught up in the middle of it. And so there's two sides of the yard. One was New York and one was DC. My cellmate literally grabbed me by the sleeve and like tried to pull me back to my cell and told me to stay in the cell because he didn't want anything to happen to me. And I was concerned that the guys from New York would feel disrespected that I didn't jump out there for them. But what I saw was this, is I saw one guy from DC come up and one guy from New York. And they sat and they had a discussion together on this bench in the middle of the yard, while both sides of the yard were filled with guys like battle axes ready to fight each other. They talked, they shook hands, they hugged, they walked back to their groups. And what had happened shortly thereafter was about an hour later, I thought everything had cooled off and I went jogging around the yard. I had a guy that I tutored, his name was Calvin, giant, strong guy that I used to jog with, and he was kind of like a bodyguard of sorts. But he told me to run up ahead and don't turn around, don't look. And what happens when we say don't turn around, don't look? I turned and I looked, and I saw the DC guys pull a guy out into the yard, one of their own, who they discovered was their petty thief, and they knocked his jaw off. With the boulder they dug up from the yard, they held him, and they just hit him in the jaw with the boulder, and they knocked his jaw off, and they left him there in the yard, and I was just like, I've never seen anything like that before. But the reason, and I know I shouldn't get off on a tangent like this, because I really don't like going down this rabbit hole, was that violent. I was at this high security prison. You saw none of that here at the CMU. What you saw was solidarity. What you saw was people coming together and talking. What you saw was people trying to feed each other. The moment I landed at the CMU, the first thing I saw were Muslims from cases that I saw in the news. I saw Jose Padilla's co-defendant. I saw members of Virginia Jihad Network, the individuals from Lashkar-e-Taiba that are accused of sending paintballs to Lashkar-e-Taiba training camps. I mean, these are people that I read about and saw their pictures of in the newspapers. And they come up to me and they're like, Aki, are you Palestinian? I said, no. Because I was in the hole a little bit before then, so I had a bit of a beard. I was a little bit darker because I was in North Carolina. I was like, no, I'm not Palestinian. And he's like, you're vegetarian though? I said, yeah, I'm vegetarian. He said, well, we brought you a bunch of stuff. And the imam of the group on the bed had apples, he had the ramen noodles, but with the seasoning packets taken out because they knew the seasoning packets had meat ingredients in it. They had a pair of shower shoes. They said, be really careful when you take a shower in that shower. There's all different types of bacteria on the floor. We try to keep it clean, but here's a pair of shoes. You don't want to get an infection. And the first thing I thought was, are these guys trying to indoctrinate me? Because my street smart from being in that higher security prison was nobody gives anything to someone for free without asking for something in return. The truth was they didn't ask for anything in return. They just wanted to make sure that I was okay. They then asked me if I wanted to come to prayer, and I said, I don't know how to say this, but I'm not Muslim. They said, that's okay. Do you believe in God? And I was like, I think I do. Yeah, I believe in God. And they were like, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. And I was like, okay. I was like, that was it. They respected my space. They weren't zealots. They weren't the way the media painted them. They wanted me to be safe. They wanted to make sure I didn't get an infection in the shower. They wanted to make sure I was well fed. They started yelling at this man who was called Intelligence Research Specialist, who is one of the few guards that actually interacted with the men who were in the CMU, saying we got to make sure he gets a vegetarian meal tomorrow, make sure he gets a vegetarian meal. They were advocating for me the moment I arrived. And these were the type of people that they were. So immediately, I grew up a liberal. I grew up in a household where my mother was a hippie. She encouraged me to get involved with activism, and that kind of led me down this whole road of ending up in prison, right? But even then, as liberal as you try to be, as anti-racist as you try to be, you end up still in your own head building these social constructs for people where you think that they must be this way. You know, like you realize that the system might be inherently racist or xenophobic, and what's happening to Muslims is somehow, it's Islamophobia, it's xenophobia, it's a witch hunt of sorts. And you might say this in practice, but still when you read about the Jose Padilla case, you're like, man, that's a pretty serious thing. And you develop this construct of how you think of these people. And then I meet this guy the moment I land, and I have all of those ideas of what he is shattered. And then I start asking myself questions time and time again, like, what did he do? What didn't he do? What kind of person is he? And if he's guilty of what he's charged with, how could someone who's this kind have been brought to this chapter in their life when they did something as atrocious as what they're being accused of? So what I saw, I finally got to talk to every single man, and a lot of them, unlike other prisons, were open about what their case was about. Because this was still technically a high security prison, most men kept on their personal property a copy of their sentencing manuscript, it's like their sentencing transcript. And that was something they used to do at the medium high security prison when they thought someone was a rapist or a sex offender or hurt children. They would do like what they call paper check, like where are your papers? And you'd have to display your papers to the gang leaders to show that you're not someone who hurt children. People that hurt children aren't welcome on the yards. They make them check into protective custody, or they extort them, they do all these other things. So we were doing kind of paper checks on each other, and I was able to read the confidential sentencing transcripts that the media wasn't allowed to see in the Jose Padilla case. So here I am reading all about Jose Padilla, down to like how he came home and how he was charged and what he was charged with. And what I read in the newspaper was completely different than what I read in that sentencing guideline. Not only that, but I read the judge apologizing to each and every one of them in an in-camera motion for what had happened in the media. And that was like eye-opening for me. These guys are still serving jail time. they're not serving the maximum for what the federal government was asking for, but also the story that we all read about a dirty bombing plot wasn't the story at all. This man went on Hajj in Mecca. He met a couple of people that were under surveillance from the CIA while he was there. And while he was there, he, young, impressionable, former Latin king, was like, you know, I want to be serious about my Islam. And he was serious about his Islam. He actually turned his life around while in a juvenile detention center for being a member of the Latin Kings, and he found Islam while in the prison system. And this was his kind of like feeling his life. He worked hard, he bought a house for his mother. His mother had a house in Florida, he had a car, and he turned to a man by the name of Adin bin Hassoun to sell his car to give money to his mother because he wasn't able to support his mother while he was in Mecca, right? So that brings in a second co-defendant for him. Adin bin Hassoun was one of his co-defendants, and he was charged with material support for terrorists, for selling the car, and for being involved with the charity that was building an orphanage in Sarajevo. Now, this larger plot of an orphanage building in Sarajevo and this idea of a man that went on Hajj and met the wrong people and was enamored by them and went to he did go to a training camp where people were taking pot shots at bales of hay and were on these like monkey bars and stuff like that. He did go to one of those places, but it wasn't necessarily for the purposes of killing Americans. He just got enamored by this whole lifestyle of like Muslim militiamen and things like that. So what had happened at that point was the man who sold his car, Adin bin Hassoun, and that's actually a really long name. Adin bin Hassoun, he sold his mother's car and ended up on the radar for that. He also ran a charity that was based out of the Balkans, where essentially children that were orphans from the whole Balkan conflict, he wanted to build an orphanage for them. Adin bin Hassoun was Palestinian. He was a member of the Islamic community in Florida, and he came to the States when he was 19 years old with this kind of grandiose vision of what the United States was. He got involved with a software company that did the digital networks for telephonics companies, like when cell phone towers communicate with each other. He made millions doing that with the inception of cell phones. In the process of making millions, he started these charitable nonprofits where he wanted to support children because he believes in tithing, or zakat as they call it in Islam, that you have to give 25% of what you make back to the people. And if you don't do that, you're not a good Muslim. So this is where he was basing it on. He explained the whole thing to me. But what the problem is two things. He sold the car, right? The second thing was that the institution, the orphanage that he wanted to build in Sarajevo, he contracted union help to help him build it. What's not said, though, is that the union he contracted to, during a time of conflict, culturally in the region, it's like they're the Minutemen. If you've ever seen our history of like how workers all got together to fight, and then they go back like an Elks Club or a union, and they go back to work when the fighting is done. Well, this group, essentially a union, was applauded during the Clinton administration for their DIY fight against ethnic cleansing, right? So they were championed, they received all these awards and all these accolades and public support for what they were doing to fight Slobodan Milosevic. However, 9/11 happened, and after 9/11, there became this laundry list in the Bush administration of groups that were deemed as extremist. So this group made a transition from being a group that was celebrated to a group that ended up on this extremist list because A, they were Muslim, and B, they were armed at some point in their career. At that point, in this chapter of the Balkan conflict, there's no more conflict. All they were doing was construction, right? Now, are they capable of going back to fighting? Yeah, they're capable of going back to fighting, but they were totally dormant. All they do is construction. The same can be said for elements of Hezbollah. There are subsets of Hezbollah where all they do is public infrastructure. So are you going to say that the individuals that are engaged in public infrastructure are the same people shooting at Israeli troops? No, it's a different chapter entirely. You can't paint with this broad brush. So he's accused of giving money in excess of millions of dollars to build this building in the Balkans to this company to do the labor, and now there's this direct line of finances to a group that the Bush administration labels as an extremist group, right? Post 9/11, there became this larger overarching conspiracy charge called material support for terrorists. material support for terrorists is overbroad in its language. It's over vague in its language. And the problem with the material support statute is you could be pretty much guilty of it for a variety of things, including moral support, including media and PR support for an organization, even if you're not giving physical subsidies to them. So there are actually anti-war activists right now in an open grand jury into anti-war activists in the Midwest and also in North Carolina for their involvement with conflict mediation in Gaza and in Colombia dealing with the FARC. They have actually negotiated to get people that are kidnapped back, but because they have personal relationships with the FARC, now they're being charged as complicit with a terrorist organization. Let me rephrase that, not charged yet, but the grand jury's open, and the federal government hopes to bring indictments against anti-war activists for that. That's very dangerous. These are individuals that are actually trying to craft peace, that are trying to take people that have, swords and beat them into plowshares, if you want to use that analogy, that biblical analogy. But that type of people, those type of people, terrorism legislation should not be used against them. They're actually trying to stop terror, right? In the case of Imam bin Hassoun, did he possibly make some mistakes? If you were a good lawyer, would you advise your guy to be selling Jose Bedia's car or anything else like that? Probably not. But what he did was not overtly criminal, and what he did certainly wasn't sinister, and it definitely wasn't terrorism, right? But what they were able to do, he convinced him, because he was definitely a man of conscience, and he was active in the Muslim community in Florida, to make a phone call, right? And so he said to Jose Bedia's mother, hey, I want to meet with you. The feds want your son to come home. They're threatening to audit you. I don't want trouble to happen to you. I think if we get him to come home and actually talk to the FBI, they're not going to charge him. He was a bit naive. He thought that if we all just had a conversation, that this would all just go away, right? So what he did is he went to Jose Bedia's mother's house, and he was like, listen, so these are these federal agents. They've been surveilling you. They've been surveilling me. They want Jose to come home. I think if Jose comes home out of a sign of good faith and walks himself into the FBI office, this can all kind of be cleared up, because they think he's involved with Al-Qaeda or something. This is what the FBI was thinking about Jose Padilla, and the CIA was thinking about him overseas, right? So they finally get him on the phone in his mother's kitchen, right? And the FBI says, hey, can you pass me the phone real quick? He's like, hi, this is Agent so-and-so, so-and-so. I'm in your mom's kitchen. And automatically, Jose's like, what are you doing with my mother? What are you doing to my mother? And he's like, well, son, and this is in the transcript, well, son, we don't want anything to happen to your mother. I don't want you to think we're threatening your mother. We just really, we just want her to talk some sense to you. We really want to see you come home. We want to talk to you. We have some questionable, ideas about things that you're involved in, and you can really show us that you're not doing anything wrong by coming home. Right? Well, post 9/11, there was this whole scurry of you didn't get Osama bin Laden, you didn't get this, you didn't get that, and there was the Ashcroft and some of the Bush administration felt this immense pressure to have some sort of collar to say we got somebody, right? So they were going to arrest him anyway when he came home. But when they arrested him, somebody, and no one wants to claim responsibility for this, somebody sent a press release when he hit Chicago O'Hare Airport saying a member of Al-Qaeda landed in the Midwest, right? And their intention was a dirty bomb plot on DC, right? He was the fall guy in that. Yeah.
Was there ever any radioactive material connected?
No ability to purchase radioactive material, no plot, no conversation about it, no recorded conversation, no email, no nothing. The federal agents, there's a series of things they go through, right? Federal agents bring what's called a complaint first. The complaint gets heard by a grand jury. Sometimes the grand jury has in between 90 hours to, I think it's up to 18 months to return the indictment, right? And sometimes they can be done these emergency procedures, right? They can go to, for example, a FISA court to get a warrant immediately. That can be done at midnight, but they have to actually go through an administration if they think something's about to happen. But when it comes to the regular courts, there's a process, right? The first thing that happens in the process is a federal complaint. I'll tell you one thing, there was never a federal complaint about Jose Padilla being involved with anything to do with radioactive anything.
So the dirty bomb, they call him the dirty bomber, but that's a whole made-up story.
The dirty bomb thing is something that happened in the media, right? When he entered the courtroom, and most of those court records are not available to the public, when he entered the courtroom, they never said that once. They never said it in front of the jury. They never slandered him in front of the jury saying he was involved with that. But let's be real, people. If you got a dozen jury members, right? no one's gonna not know who Jose Padilla is because he was on the cover of every single newspaper.
Right, he's the dirty
You know,
bomb.
they go through this voir dire process of saying, have you felt like you've been biased by the news media? And people say, no, I'm not biased by the news media. I think it could be fair and balanced. Bullshit, fair and balanced. You just read on the front page story that this dude was gonna blow up DC with the dirty bombs. And if there's not enough evidence, you're still gonna convict his ass. The worst part was, is they took Adinamit Hassoun and a man that taught at George Washington University, Dr. Jayusi, right? And because they had connections to the Padilla family, they then packaged them as a single case and then said, you guys can have severance if you tell on each other, right? And they said, we're not gonna tell on each other because they're men of conscience, right? Well, they all decided to go to trial together. In doing so, you have this, you know, this pariah, Jose Padilla, at the top of the case, and these other guys sitting underneath him. What happens to the other guys sitting underneath him? They're equally as fucked because they're sitting behind the same table as Jose Padilla, right? So even if they have nothing on Adinamit Hassoun and they have nothing on Dr. Jayusi, they're going to have an airtight case no matter what. So they call it piggybacking. And so that's what they did to these two guys. Now, Jose Padilla, because he actually had some interaction with guns, he went to the ADX Florence, right? But these other two guys, a teacher and a mom and philanthropist, they can't possibly get maximum security points. So where do they put them? You throw them into the CMU. Yeah.
Why didn't their lawyers sever the charges? Why would I understand why Padilla would want to do it, but why would the lawyers for the two under cases ever consent to being bundled?
You know, I asked them that, and that also happened in my case, by the way. We had an option to sever without telling on each other, but I chose not to because my co-defendant was facing 30 years, and I thought by being at the table and I knew there was no evidence against me, that I increased his chances of being acquitted. And actually, I don't know if I had an impact or not. He got 7 years. No, I'm sorry, he got 6 years, and not the 37 years he was facing.
63 years.
What?
63 or 6 actually.
6 years. He did the full 6 years. Right. We're about to end. Anyway, instead of getting sidetracked on some of the individual cases, what is most telling about the communications management unit was they failed the first time they tried to bring this proposal for what was called a CTU. Congress said no. You're not allowed to do it. It reeks of xenophobia. It's a black eye in the terms of press. And they were just like, you got to revise this. So Harley Laplin, the man who was the federal director of the Bureau of Prisons, made this idea that in order to lower the classification of the prison to something that was more middle ground, right, that was no longer maximum, there's a few ways that he can do it. One was that he had to fire staff, right? So he cut his staff by 1/3 at each of the prisons, both Terre Haute and Indiana, right? And then he took the live ammunition out of the gun turrets, right? These men aren't necessarily a violent risk, but what they were trying to do is they were trying to prevent situations where like a man would tie a note around a Walkman battery and then throw it past the razor wire in hopes that someone mowing the lawn outside would pick it up, and then that would like make its way back to Al-Qaeda or any one of these things. This is the argument they're trying to make, was that we can't let them have any communication. They shut off the phones, they shut off visitation. These men can no longer have contact visitation with their family or their children, which is one of the most psychologically damaging things for these men, period. Even at maximum security prisons, a person can hold their child. So, and they always have an opportunity for that. Actually, at ADX Florence, people have an opportunity for 18 hours of visitation each month. They get 2 hours of visitation each month at the CMUs, and that's behind plexiglass, through a phone. And that's something that I know you see sometimes on television, but that's only supposed to happen in county jails, only while someone's in transit or being held temporarily. Whenever someone's in a permanent confinement process, there's actually international law that says you need to be able to have interaction with your family because it's part of the healing and retribution process of being in prison, part of the corrective process of being in prison. So they nix that entirely. They sever someone completely from communications, and worse yet, there's no due process. So for example, if someone gets designated to the CMU, there's no legal avenue for them to challenge it. All the other stuff, if you get sent to the home or the federal prison, there's what's called the administrative procedures, or what do they call it? Well, there's these forms, BP8, BP9, BP10, BP13. These are forms that you have access to for free, where you can voice your grievances and challenge on a very basic level, on an administrative level, how to actually get yourself out of that situation. If your BP13 fails, you go to court, right? And you can challenge it in a courtroom. But there's nothing provided to these men like that. They're totally off the grid when it comes to prisoners. Once you're designated to the CMU, it's like you're no longer part of the federal prison process. You get sent to this place and it's like you get disappeared, right? So these individuals lack the due process rights of challenging their designation there. And then once there, they can't appeal or challenge why that they should be removed from the unit, saying, I don't really belong here, I want to have access to my family. And what you're seeing with this void of due process, this administrative black hole that's there, is you're seeing it coupled with CIA and military intelligence coming by for visits, right? They have a rule. The inmates and guards are not allowed to talk to each other, so you don't actually have any interaction with the guards. You don't go to a chow hall to get your food. Instead, it comes down to this elevator kind of dumbwaiter into the middle of the unit, and you pull out a cart from this elevator door, and we all beat each other. Now, that says something about the type of people that are in the unit, because if you're dealing with this in other prison yards, then someone will take twice as much food for themselves and not everything else. This one, everybody feeds each other, they all take trays, we all take turns feeding each other, everything's even, everyone's well taken care of. But again, no interactions with the regular guards. The only people that actually walk through are special deputized people that are dealing with military intelligence, CIA, or these other group of individuals called IRS, Intelligence Research Specialists, not Internal Revenue Service. But these guys walk through and they lay this pressure game on the guys. They do this, well, don't you want to go home and see your kids? You could go home, or there's this job we got for you. And in the case of Adim Amin Hassoun, he was the guy that got me food, he got me shower shoes, he got me everything. But I saw this man finally reach this pressure where eventually it led him down this road of starting to cooperate with the state. And since I left, he started cooperating with the CIA to try and bring people in Lebanon. He grew up partially in Lebanon, he's born in Palestine, and some of what he's trying to do is he's trying to identify people in videos. For example, they'll bring a laptop to his cell and circle people and say, oh, this person's this person's that, in relation to, like Hezbollah or Hamas or whatever those groups may be, in hopes of getting this morsel of seeing his kids one day. We do have to wrap this up, but I have cards right here. I've been trying to challenge this not only through press releases, but I'm working with the Center for Constitutional Rights, not as a lawyer, but as a witness in the lawsuit against the CMU to try and challenge the constitutionality of it. I actually think that there's a good argument because Harley Lapland bypassed the Administrative Procedures Act in developing the unit, that it could actually be shut down on those terms.
You guys can see this or not?
And so I encourage people to get involved with it. I do a website called Sparrow Media.
Why were you put in such tight communication? Were they fearful you were to tell other people how to do what you did?
That's a good question. I don't have the answer to that. I don't really know. And I think it'll be a little too grand for me to think I was so important they had to throw me in there.
Discussion
I don't think I was that important.
Andy
I think it was a
Stepanian.
combination of things. I think they wanted to make
He
sure
was
that
put
they had
in
this 28%, so it wasn't 100% Muslim.
high maximum
Because that's essentially the
high
crux of
security
the lawsuit
prison
that's
as
happening right now is that the
communications
larger
management
prison
units.
systems in the country, no more than 11 or 12%
simply for being
of the
an
men
activist
have identified
and
at one
PC
point in their
a lot.
lives as being Muslim, right? So why does 72% at this unit identify as being Muslim? And the Terre Haute unit was actually opened first.
Federal
In the
coercion.
first couple of months that it was open, was 96%
segregation of
Muslim.
units.
So if you do the math on
You
that,
can
it
visit
almost
his
sounds like women being
his
Muslim
website at
housing units,
sparrowmedia.net.
which is against so many civil rights laws. So what they're trying to do now
SPARROW
is
media,
balance a democratic.
media.net.
And I had actually one guard
And
call me about
from the
this
Sparrow
on
Project,
Facebook.
which is
New Yorker did an
grassroots
article about
publicity
me. He called me a balancer.
agency.
I was actually doing the laundry one day. Totally bigoted comment. He's
And
like,
I will
he says,
return.
keep your head up.
And
He's like,
it's
you're
time
gonna
for
go home
closing
soon. Don't
statement,
worry, you're
or
only here for
closing
balance.
circle.
And I was like, what do you mean?
Finally.
He's like, you're not like all these Arab fucks. He's like, you're different. Little did he know I'm actually half Arab. I'm just Arab and Christian. So